back to the Health and Social Care Business Podcast. And today we're focusing on a topic crucial for many of our listeners in the health and social care sector: tenders and the tendering process. To shed a light on that today, we have two very special guests. So joining us today is Dudley, a health and social care consultant and a business strategist at People Care Services, who also has an extensive experience in supporting providers in 18 London boroughs. He's also the chair of the Registered Managers Groups and the co-chair of the Race Equity Reference Group Skills for Care. Our second guest today is Mr. Peter Webb, founding director of the London Care and Support Forum, LCAS. With over 25 years of experience in social care across England, he has also worked as a consultant for SME providers on business management, restructuring, marketing, and tender opportunities. Thank you so much for accepting to join us today, and you're both very welcome to our podcast.
Thank you very much for having us today. And it's a pleasure to be sharing an area and a topic which seems to be heavily, moving in a space which actually provides a lot of insight for domiciliary care as well.
I would agree with what Dudley has just said, and also tendering has become much more important over the past couple of years, and it's something that is new to many providers, particularly the smaller ones.
Absolutely. So today we'll be delving right into the world of tender writing and bidding processes, specifically within the health and social care sector. We all know how complicated and tiring the application process for tenders can be, from filling the ITTs, SSQs, and method statements. I've realized that the tendering process has become so complex in recent times, especially with framework councils presenting new requirements like the social values, TOMS calculators, GDPR regulations, and things like that. How do you think these new requirements will affect the tender writing process? And do you think they reduce the possibilities of a successful tender outcome?
My view is that although the tendering process has, if you like, become turbocharged, the basics haven't changed very much. People need to actually bid for tenders that they have a chance of getting.
Yeah.
They need to not be afraid of taking on expertise in areas such as TUPE or GDPR, for example. And they need to be honest. And Dudley and I have been involved in many tenders. And we've seen the aftermath of those tenders where people have failed, and they frankly had little hope of getting there in the first place. And they could well have wasted a good deal of time and money.
I agree with that. I think it's also very interesting because I think there is a lot of reaction to what's going on, and people hear that, for example, local authorities are cutting their budgets. We also hear that there are bigger players coming to the marketplace. So a lot of the SMEs who probably just got their tenders without doing that much work actually have to work that much harder. And just like any CQC inspection, the whole point is putting your best foot forward. So if you do that, you look at your local area, you make connections, there is a higher possibility that you're going to get your tender. Just because things are done slightly differently, we know that the marketplace is changing, things are becoming more digital. They're looking at other areas about sustainability and asking questions, which you probably should be looking at anyway as any form of business.
Okay. So you mentioned earlier about providers who bid for tenders without having the experience to do so. So we know that yourself and Dudley have supported lots of providers across London's with tenders. So what challenges do you see organizations face when it comes to tenders? If you could go into a bit more detail, I know you previously said sometimes companies who are unprepared bid, but what challenges in particular do they face in your experience, and how do you suppose we as consultants can help them bridge that gap and help improve their capabilities and abilities to meet the high standards demanded by the buyers?
I think most of the tender opportunities are for dom care providers. And one thing that those providers have to look at is the finances against their finances, in that sense, against what is required within the tender documentation. if, say, the dom care provider has a turnover of 500,000 and the tender has a minimum of turnover level of 3 million, there's no point in going through the whole process. If you've got a turnover of, say, 500,000, then you need to be looking at bidding for a value of say, a couple £100,000. There's no point in bidding for a value of £1 million because you're not going to get it. That's about the local authority's view of financial accountability and financial sustainability. And before most of the tenders are finalised or issued, there will be meetings, market get-togethers. I would say to providers, go to those, ask the questions. And if small providers can actually link together to work as a group, that's very helpful for themselves and for the local authority. And it also works very well for their business continuity policy.
Well, I definitely agree. I think there's a lot there to unpick, but just going into a bit more depth, what challenges you see for organizations when it comes to tender writing. I think people are a lot more savvier than before. So, and there is a lot more competition than before. So, for example, we know that there was a various tender for Lambeth, for example, and there were so many operators that were from outside the borough who actually went to apply for it, whereas before it really wasn't the case. So now you're having to up your game, you're having to actually showcase what you're doing. So what I would say is really document anything that you have and what you do. Make sure, you cross your T's, dot your I's, but you also see why someone should come to you. What's the attraction? So it's almost as if you're trying to win business again, not expecting the actual commissioners to actually give you it, the business, because you had it before. And the assumption with a lot of actually providers think that, well, I had it for the last 3 years, so why shouldn't they give it to me? Why are they giving it to someone else?
Yeah.
So I would turn around and say those are sort of some of the challenges that they can look at. Just be realistic.
And I think Dudley has highlighted the speciality area, but if you're a dom care provider, don't bid for, say, a tender that's focused on learning disability, because that's not your area of expertise. You may not have a registration for it. You won't have the staff trained for it. And as the borough goes through the bids, they will rule you out. And even if you got the work, we are now seeing that CQC are actually focusing on specialities when they do inspections.
So I have two questions. You mentioned that a lot of providers should have a look at the financial standing before they even approach a tender, but sometimes, especially with the DPSs, the financial criteria is not stated, and a lot of times, even with the DPSs, it's not very clear what the financial threshold is. And the bid also mentions that all providers are welcome to bid. When I mean all providers, I mean at every stage of your business. If you're a new provider, if you're a large provider. So in a situation like that, if a service provider sees a bid like that, they've had a look at the documentation and they haven't seen that, what do they do? Do they just avoid the tender, or what do they do?
I think that if you're looking with say dom care providers, there probably are too many dom care providers in the marketplace, which has made a very, very competitive, very, very price competitive market zone. And with many of the DPSs, the deciding factor from a local authority viewpoint is the lowest price will win.
Okay.
And if you're a provider, you need to know exactly what your cost base is and what profit margin you need to make, and you need to stop before you go below that. And Dudley and I will have seen lots of providers who don't actually know what their costs are per hour or per member of staff. They don't have a plan for 3 months' time or 12 months' time. So they lack that sort of business continuity going forward.
Right.
No, I agree. I think there's a lot around of business acumen, but yeah, definitely.
All right, that's brilliant. So this question is for Peter, and Dudley, please, you could also contribute to this as well. From your experience working with LCAS, are there any ways smaller providers can bridge this gap and demonstrate their qualifications? Because I know that you've mentioned if you don't have the experience or if you don't have the expertise, for example, if you're in dom care, if you entered a very competitive market such as the dom care space and you're not registered to provide learning disability, however, you have a learning disability nurse within your team, as an example, what are the things that small providers can do if they lack certain capabilities to improve their chances?
I think it's about demonstrating what abilities you've got.
Okay.
And if you read the number of failed tender documents that I have read, they tell you very little about that organization. They're very bland, they're very generic rather.
Yeah.
And they will not mention things like we have a skilled nurse on board who has these areas of speciality. We frequently see no mention of in-house training, for example, and often a successful tender application will have examples of case studies, obviously anonymized, but it will say what they have done and how they have demonstrated that they've improved a lot of the client, and also how they've managed to reduce costs. And many of the tenders nowadays are looking for a, if you like, a continuing healthcare type approach or a reablement approach. So it's being able to demonstrate those. And the area you mentioned, co-working with nurses, co-working with health.
Yeah. And you also mentioned earlier a better approach for smaller providers is to sort of form a consortium. So consortium bidding is something that it's probably going to be new to a lot of small providers. So how would they go about doing that? Because there's a legal aspect of that. How would they share the work? How would it, once they get the actual tender, how is it going to be implemented? What would the contract implementation look like with that, especially for new providers who already, they lack the experience and the knowledge of going to tender?
Well, if you look at how some of the larger providers work with co-working, what they do is they set up a special purpose vehicle, which is a company, and they're all part of that. Now, that's perhaps a bit excessive for small providers. So the local authority would look for a lead partner.
Okay.
And the rest of the partners would be listed within the tender. And the reason it's useful from a local authority or the NHS point of view is that if one of those parties fails, then there is 3 or 4 or however many it is to pick up the slack, to sort out the problems. So the local authority does not have that problem to pick up.
Brilliant.
And they would have the best way is to have some sort of legal agreement which they can get drawn up quite readily by a solicitor. It's not terribly expensive because it's the sort of thing that a solicitor would have a template of ready to go.
Absolutely. So how about in a situation, would you, or this is more of an advice, how about, or rather, if a service provider with small companies are looking to go down that route, what are the things they need to take into consideration? So for example, we know that a lot of tenders now, if you have inadequate or requires improvement, it's a disadvantage for you. So does it matter? I know it sounds like an obvious question, but for a consortium, does it matter your CQC rating? And what are the things that they also need to look out for when they're choosing consortium partners?
Well, if you look at CQC ratings, such as inadequate, that inadequate rating may have been 4 or 5 years ago, and the manager may well have changed in the interim. So it's about picking areas of expertise and having confidence in your partners. And there are those people who are providers who are chasing up CQC to get a further inspection to raise their game to good. But it's back to a degree, it's specialities. If you're a dom care provider and you're covering one part of a borough, you can use another provider to cover a different part of the borough. So although you're co-working, you're not directly competing. And if somebody has got expertise in, say, supported living or in working with volunteer groups, then they're bringing something extra to the party.
Absolutely. So it's a fact that even with providers going above and beyond to make sure they deliver top-notch tenders, the selection process can be quite rigorous and competitive.
Sure. I mean, I think we have seen one of the commissioners told me that they'd had 200 applications. So they had to delay the the response because it took them so long to actually go through them.
Okay.
And what providers need to realize sometimes is that the questions in a tender document aren't necessarily all marked by the same person at the local authority. So they may be divided up so that one group of people will mark one question, another group of people will mark another question. So each question needs to have a bit of background in it, not assume that the markers, the checkers, have read all the documentation. And when you look at some of the responses that go in, and you've got, say, 1,000 words or whatever it is, that can look at the outset quite a lot until you start to fill it in. And it's sometimes easier to get more points across in a bullet point approach or with a bullet point approach rather than actually a straightforward narrative. But again, some of the simple key strategies are, tell the truth and stick to answering the question. Tell them what they want to know, not trying to answer a different question because you know more about that one.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think there's also some other things outside of this, because I think new providers, when they set up the business, their aim is, I want to win a contract, I want to win a tender.
Yeah,
And it's their
exactly.
sole purpose of their business. You lack experience, but yet you want to have a big contract which is going to provide you and lead you and pay for your mortgage. So there is just the element of, even people start up, even with registering with CQC, the fact is that you may not be inspected for quite a while. And that may be one of the first requirements that's needed for a tender in itself. So what are you going to do? So new providers, I hear they come to me and say, Dudley, why hasn't CQC come and inspected me? I needed it. So what we have to look at is a different model, because I think if you're an expert in your field or you bring some experience to the table, the likelihood you are going to be taken more seriously. What I tend to say to new providers is, if you are going to specialize in any area, try and find a private client, actually document what you're doing, actually showcase how you've gone about it, get the testimonies from there, or work, or as Peter mentioned, co-production with another organization. Even if it means that you take up some small jobs or work with them, showcase that you can deliver, and you've showed compliance experience is there. Because one thing that people are going to measure you on is your success and your experience and your knowledge. If you can showcase that and specialize in any field, that's possible. My final piece of advice I would say is that everyone always goes for the mass market, or why don't you pick something which is unique?
BBSs.
Yep. Why don't you pick something which is unique to yourself as an organization, which means that you stand out and you are different from the others, from the norm. Otherwise, you're just in the same, as they call, taxi rank as the others.
But the problem with that is the market, well, the buyers decide. So for example, if a service provider specializes or has a lot of experience dealing with asylum seekers, as an example, I'm not saying this is the case. What if there isn't enough tenders out there for that? And at the end of the day, it is a business and they do want to grow. So how does that strategy benefit a company like that or a service like that?
I think what you're seeing, and anyone can be testimony of it, is that a lot of providers have been stung because they've all put their eggs in, say, for example, the London market or certain boroughs, and they're all going for the same tenders. And you'll probably see a lot of the names going around trying to get it done. There can only so many people that are going to win the tenders. Yes. So that's the
Yes.
first port of call. So I would say to individuals, if you are really being very serious in this space, do your market research, look at the competitors in your area, look about maybe potentially what you can do different. And if you cannot, but then you may potentially have to go in other parts of the country where maybe the pool or the amount of providers are a lot less, and you can also
Demand is
demonstrate.
higher.
Yes, then that's something. So you have to look at different techniques and strategies. This is not an accurate science. And it's not the case of, I applied to somewhere, they didn't accept me, and I'm upset.
Mm,
This is a business. You have to innovate. You have to move. You have to think about how to make your business grow and succeed, because there's always going to
absolutely.
be changes that happen to the marketplace.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Peter, you were going to say something.
I mean, Dudley's made a very good point about innovation, and one provider, a small provider, got into working with the local authority because they had a very innovative style, and they were able to demonstrate to the local authority the facts and figures they could provide and how that made them an economically viable business. And also they were able to give the local authority a lot of usable data. And one other small provider, they had a very good reference when they put a bid in because they'd done work. They'd actually applied and worked with a couple of housing associations on supported living sites. So they had some expertise in that field. And although it wasn't directly related, it was dom care. And it gave them a reference. And that reference was very valuable.
So with that, we would encourage small providers to go out and look for experiences either by co-production, so doing a co-production with another company and gain a bit of experience, going into the community, looking at innovative solutions that you can actually provide to the local authorities. I was actually going to add to that as well. I was also going to speak about innovation, because a lot of times when service providers reach out to us, and we try to do the one-to-one interviews to gather as much information as possible, even the responses we get back is also quite generic, because most people are maybe talking from the QC policies, procedures, and all the other generic information that is out there. So in the sector, I do think that there's a lot of lack of innovation from small providers. And if small providers really want to break through in the market, for me, being innovative and co-producing, I see it as a way forward in terms of successful strategies for small providers.
Just another point on innovation in itself, I think I've been involved a lot with technology and tech, and I think tech is a huge marketplace to help showcase a lot of the tasks that were very time consuming with the technology. As long as the technology works, it works with the local systems, and it's another area of which you can look at as well.
Yes,
No.
brilliant. So this is a follow-up question, and I know we've touched upon this, but we just want to know, can you recommend any strategies for existing providers? We've spoken about new providers, but there are existing providers who have been in the marketplace for a while, and they've now seen that the market space has changed. They have a lot of competitors, and some new providers are actually quite, well, innovative new providers. They can also be serious competitors. So for existing providers, what strategies can they use to remain relevant in a competitive market?
I think I have seen recently a provider who was a contractor to a local authority, and they rebid for the next 5 years, and they failed to get through. And when we actually looked at what they'd done, why they'd failed, they'd put in pretty much the same bid that they put in 5 years ago. So they hadn't demonstrated how they'd moved forward. And
That's a fantastic point.
they really, with regard to the IT in the business, which I'd highlighted to them as not one of their strengths, they hadn't moved forward. They weren't able, they'd not embraced the new technology available to them, that they could have had support from the NHS to actually put in place. They made no effort to get towards achieving digital social care records. They didn't have DSPT, so they'd automatically be marked down by the local authority in the sense because they didn't have NHS mail. There were some really simple things, and their record as a care provider, their record from clients was good. Their CQC report is good, but they'd actually stood still, and they had worked hard with their training, but nowhere in the documentation were they able to demonstrate that.
evidence, evidence, evidence. So evidence and innovation is what I would say. I've also experienced something similar as well, where a client came and they were not successful, and we also looked through the bid, and there hadn't been any difference to the previous tender that they put out there. Sort of relying on the fact that because they'd previously won, they would automatically be accepted in the next round. But just the same way new providers have to be innovative, existing providers have to keep growing and improving the services and being up to date with the new technologies that have been available. DSPT, and especially now that the ICBs and health and social care sector is taking a more collaborative approach, where the local authorities and the NHS are now working collaboratively together. So it's just like a basic practice to have certain things like having an NHS email for better data security and transfer of data. So yes, I agree, for existing providers, innovation as well. And when you're doing a repeat bid, not using the same material, rather demonstrating that in the 5 years you've worked with the local authority, you are not where you were when you started. You have grown, and you're able to evidence that growth.
And I think one of the frequent weak areas that we see is if a local authority, as part of the documentation, asks for an organizational structure.
Right.
The structure is very pyramidal, and it doesn't include the outside bodies that they work with, the volunteer groups or the other stakeholders. And
that's a very good tip.
And the manager, I mean, if you're a small dom care or a growing dom care provider, the manager is vital. That's obvious. But
yeah,
if the manager is unwell or their family is unwell and they have to take time off, there needs to be 2 or 3 deputy managers who are heading for their level 5 that cover the areas of speciality, so that that manager can leave the business for a month, or say they're taken ill. The business continues because there are 2 trusted lieutenants there who can pick up.
No, I agree. I think there's other elements which are more basic that people sometimes forget, because from once you've done one tender, it's about using that information, storing it, making sure you update it, even slightly adapt it, and also work with your tender writers as well, because it's always good to hope that your tender writers understand, because they're usually writing on your behalf. So make sure you feed them the right information so they're able to sell and put together a good tender for you. A lot of the time, the information that's shared isn't good enough, or you're leaving in the hands of the tender writer who's probably doing the same tender for maybe 3 or 4 or 5 other businesses. So pretty much there isn't much difference. It's what you feed them is also very important. So update that as well. Don't just rest because you've got a tender and think you can just send the old stuff forward, as Peter said before.
And
absolutely.
Sorry, with tender applications nowadays, it will say, what is your website address? So if you look at organizations' websites, they frequently don't have a link to their CQC report or to CQC at all, which is technically illegal. The CQC widget is easy to apply. We've actually seen providers, health social care providers, whose CQC link actually takes them to a previous better rated report, which might be good as opposed to the present inadequate or requires improvement. And if you look at the quality of some of the websites for providers, they are very, very poor.
Absolutely.
And, poor English, they've ripped off photographs from somebody else's website, which don't reproduce very well. And it looks a mess. It's not going to attract anybody.
Yes, that's one of the key areas a lot of providers also overlook. It's not just about, and I also feel with this area of technology, a lot of times, or before now, and before direct payments, and before the service users had more access to or more control of their care, and before the local authorities were really looking outside of the actual care, a lot of providers didn't feel the need to improve their digital presence or even have a nice digital presence that actually represents what they do. So what you find is a lot of companies, their websites very outdated, and it just doesn't present, or it's not a good representation of who they are. A lot of companies, it's something that they miss. As part of the tendering process, would you say having an up-to-date and a clear, for lack of a better word, good website is essential?
I think it needs to be simple. If you have a website, you've got 3 or 4 pages and they're readable, they make sense, and you can see them on a phone. Because many people access a website on a phone, and it's amazing how many websites are not visible on a phone.
Yeah, it's not mobile optimized.
Yeah, and there needs to be, if the links are on there, the links need to work. And people get a website and they have a jobs board and they have this, that, and the other link. And unless you're going to keep those absolutely up to date, don't bother.
Brilliant.
I agree. I think there is this thing about websites, but also as well, I find it the other way where people, you see the website and it's got, they do everything. They've got pictures, they've got all these things, but actually when you go to the organization, it actually is not reflective of actually of their website as well. So I would say don't try and over exaggerate your website, but actually then make it more realistic to what you're doing and just be more creative with what you've got as well.
Thank you for that, Dudley. So given your role as co-chair of the Race Equity Reference Group for Skills for Care, how can the current tendering process in the health and social care sector be adapted to better ensure that organizations with experience in delivering culturally appropriate care to the underrepresented communities are fairly considered for contracts? So you mentioned previously, a lot of people rush to bid to where they feel the opportunities are. But a lot of times there are tenders that are out there that are specific to underrepresented groups. They do pop up once in a while, but they are there. So obviously you've got experience in EDI as an EDI specialist. So I wanted to hear your opinion on that.
It's quite interesting because after COVID, a lot of care was taken potentially from care homes and given to communities. And so it meant that people were delivering the services were reflective of the communities that they were serving. So it looked about how you can provide a service where you understood, for example, the language, the religion, maybe the culture, the nuances of the individual. So they're able to receive care which is appropriate for their needs and their characteristics. And so moving on a bit further, CQC have looked at culturally appropriate care as being something that they think is really important. And that stems out in things such as regulations 10, person-centered care, also with regulations also 11, with dignity and respect as well, and also the need to consent as well. So these are really important when we think about that. But going even further, with my EDI hat on, I'm now having to go into organizations and trying to help create the understanding of how to care for those from different or have different protected characteristics. And I think it snowballed a lot more because a lot of the makeup of the sector, especially the influx of overseas workforce. So
Right.
overseas workforce actually understanding how to care for individuals, how can we demonstrate that? How can we share that you are going to be able to understand how to give medication? How are you going to understand about making sure you write care plans and records? But the other flip side as well is that also now local authorities and care providers are being taken to task or court by families who haven't received the appropriate care. And there's a case that took place where a woman's needs were not met inside an organization because they didn't have to cream her skin properly or comb her hair. She was an Afro-Caribbean woman. And also as well, the local authority also similarly taken to court as well. So, and they were responsible in the tribunal for neglect on the notion of someone's culture. So it's a great area to definitely look at. We also look now where they said there was a prejudice for those who are LGBTQIA+. 45% of the community believe that they receive prejudice with the care that they
Huge
receive.
number.
It's a huge number. So we're looking at things like that. We also know the growth of those from the first generation, Windjammer generation, and those who came to the country from the 50s and 60s are now the individuals that we'll be caring for. So are we able to demonstrate we're able to deliver a level of care that means that they are not neglected? And the new CQC framework looks at things such as the human rights element. Are people being treated with fairness? You know, is there dignity, autonomy?
Yes.
And so there is that to look at now. So it's a space where people actually don't think of, but actually needs to be demonstrated, because getting it wrong can be one of the biggest issues. And as you know, I talk a lot about culture-centered care, because culture-centered care is about actually person-centered care is great, but if you do not understand someone's culture, then no matter how personalized you get, you will get it wrong. So getting someone's culture right and understand someone's culture is a strong way of getting something right. So it's not the missed opportunities to provide communication with culture, and no barriers are missed to provide the appropriate type of care.
You know, Dudley's obviously the expert in this area, but what we see is that if an organization has good organizational culture within the business, within their operation, then it's very likely that they will pass that on, that they will provide good culturally appropriate care for the people they're looking after. It's interesting to see how this has developed, and it has come to the fore, and yet the rules and regulations, if we say that from CQC, haven't changed in that sense. It's just something that has become looked at, and the exploitation of staff has grown, and social care is now a peak sector for staff exploitation. It used to be things like nail bars and hair salons, and now social care is the top area for staff to be exploited. And this actually does link with culturally appropriate care. It links with working, and it links to things like areas such as international recruitment. And not only do people have to, organizations have to cope with CQC looking at it, you've also got UKBI from the Home Office, you've got the GLAA, which is the Gangmasters Authority, and they all link with HMRC.
I mean, can I also touch on one other area that people forget about as well, which is probably one of the things is hugely important. One of the biggest issues we know within the sector is not just recruitment, but retention. So if we're looking on both arms of it, if you feel like you are valued and belong in an organization, the likelihood you're likely to stay and you're less likely to move around. Also as well, if you're going to go to an organization which provides a real cultural awareness and it's inclusive, the chances are you're more likely to go to that organization because people are going to say good things. It's your reputation and respect. So people forget that how important this area is becoming, because outside of money, people stay due to respect, belonging, and values. And those are things which are represented if you're providing things such as culturally appropriate care in itself.
Yeah. I liked what Peter said about an organization having good organizational culture, and then that would translate to having culturally appropriate care. Because if you have a good organizational culture, what that means is within your organization, irrespective of people's values, their cultures, you know, within your team, who is a Muslim, who is a Christian, what do I need to do? When is Ramadan? When do we need to, when are they fasting? When can we adjust the schedules to accommodate their religious needs or their personal needs? If you're doing this already, within your organization, you already know that these values and these differences exist. So it's going to be easier to translate that to your clients or your service users. So again, I feel this goes back to innovation. As a new provider coming into the sector, setting up, these are the things that you would also need to include in your organizational setup, and then evidence it whilst you're going to tender, and perhaps even looking for tenders that you could, if you're going to look for niche areas or try to be innovative, or perhaps even looking for those tenders where you can really demonstrate that you're able to implement, you understand cultural appropriation. the world as we know it is constantly changing and evolving, and new trends come up every day. So, how do you guys envision the tender writing market changing in the future?
Can I quickly just come in here very quickly before Peter jumps in here?
All
So,
right.
I've been involved with tech and technology, and I think there is this whole new raft of what we know as AI, as we know, everyone knows that has come.
Of course.
And Peter will probably add on this afterwards on whether it's for the good or for the bad. And I've got nothing wrong with AI and technology helping those with, for example, tender writing.
Okay.
Only problem I have is two things. There is a responsibility that at the end of it, there is a human person that we're going to care for. So if you're going to actually get something to describe or use AI just to make your service sound fantastic, make sure you can deliver on what you put down. Yes, because if you do not, it is something that can go against you. That is number
Absolutely.
one. Yes, and I think there's that. The other side of things is that we mustn't forget us as humans are feeding the machine. So if you give, for example, the AI or the person the right information, yes, it may enhance it, but it's giving you the fundamentals. If you do not give it the right information and you have a poor tender, or then it's down to your information that you've given it. So let's not think that it's going to be some magic silver bullet that's going to help you. Yes, there is still, we still have to deliver that human touch as well. But yeah, that would be something to do with that. Peter might have some immediate sort of change that are taking place as well.
I am aware, I mean, obviously we're aware of AI and all the rest of it, but it also applies to local authorities, and they have tender reading equipment based on AI, and that will show that if a tender has been written is very similar to another tender. And we have seen examples where half a dozen tenders have been rejected because they may have come from different providers, but they all look very similar. And it could well be that those tenders had all been written by one consultant, one organization, had cost each of the providers several £1,000s, which they had paid, which weren't going to get back, and they'd simply been thrown out of the process.
So your advice to that would be for the service providers to ensure that if individuals decide to go out to tender on their own, and they use AI, or other tender writers out there decide to use AI, they need to ensure that there's a human element to it as well.
I would say more personalized, and I think also,
absolutely, I agree with that.
It's for providers to also ask the question, because usually if you do not ask your tender writer a question and they've gone off and brought you back this wonderful singing or dancing, a lot of individuals don't ask, oh, how did you get here? So
yeah,
it's your responsibility to ask.
Yeah, and also as a tender writer or as a tender writing company like ours, there's a lot of reliance on the writers. And even sometimes when we even try to even get information, we've had incidents where the service providers were upset and they were like, oh, isn't this your job? You're supposed to be doing this. So we had to educate them and say, yes, we're writing, but the information has to come from your organization. If not, this is not going to be a good bid. And quite frankly, this is a tender writing process. So you also need to know what the requirements are. And if you don't have it, you need to get your business very ready. So that collaborative approach is very, very necessary. So AI, for me, eliminates that. So the human aspect to writing is very, very key, and it still remains central. With regards to the actual tenders that have been put out there, because initially, a couple of years ago, I mean, Peter, I say a couple of years, I've been in this industry not as long as you. So you must have seen the shifts, because when I started tender writing, it was majorly frameworks that were out there, and then the DPSs were introduced. So I'm just wondering what else is going to be introduced, because we've gone from framework tenders, which is released every 4 years or every whatever frequency that the local authority or the buyer decides, to now DPSs that are open 24/7 for a very long period of time. Perhaps what next is going to come after that. So What do you think, Peter?
I mean, I can remember when tender bids, you had to take a written, a printed copy and a copy on a disc or some sort of stick, and each page had to be signed.
Oh, wow.
And in some areas there were certain answers that they wanted filling in handwriting, because that couldn't
Oh my
be
goodness.
faked. I think it's partly it's the other areas coming in. If you look at things like social value and environmental policies, these are coming into tenders now more and more. And as a registered manager or a nominated individual, a care business owner, you are not going to be an expert in all these areas. So you need to work with people who know how social value works. And if you're doing a tender in two separate tenders, say in neighboring boroughs, they're working with social value. Their values that they apply to social value in a financial sense vary quite widely. And it's not unusual to still find providers who have no links to local social groups or community groups or faith groups or volunteer groups. Well,
Absolutely.
frankly, without those links, you're not going to get through.
That's a very good point to add. That's really important. So, Dudley, did you want to add anything to that, or?
No, I think I think in this sort of modern day and era, I think it's about how, I think the bottom line is, how do we win our business? And I think from
Yes.
that point of view, you talked about how can people now stay in a space, and even companies that have been there for a while, so they're not losing business, which we're hearing now. So I think you're going to hear a lot more consortiums, words around that. You can also hear people then working and buying into franchises, because franchises have got an existing history and record, so it's a lot easier to go down that route as well. So I think you're going to see a lot more in that space. If not, you're going to see some of these players that were in the business before maybe losing out. Or the other thing I've seen is a lot of these big players are buying out a lot of smaller providers as well. So maybe it might be a good time to sell as well if you're interested. I'm not suggesting that. So this thing does happen.
Yes, the franchise model, I've also seen that that's growing, and we've had lots of companies approach us to help them start a franchise. Of course, like you would see in every market, some of these companies are not quite, but yes, you might be doing certain millions in turnover, but it doesn't mean that you're quite ready to actually be a franchise. So that's an emerging trend that I've seen, lots of companies wanting to sell their companies as a franchise. What are your thoughts? I'm curious, Peter.
I think it's probably too little too late, and they've missed the bus.
Oh, straight
I'm
to the point.
I'm going to add into this. I think there's some young companies who've been doing some good business. Dare I say, they're probably a lot younger, and I'm not having anything about, I'm not ages in regards to this. They've got more of a different approach. They use technology. They've got slick websites. They can smile. They can probably work with not just CQC, but Ofsted. They cover various different other areas as well with their businesses as well. So actually having a business which doesn't just stand still in one area and covers more than one thing. So you've got a lot of these younger businesses, and a lot of them are going into franchise earlier. So yeah, so look out, because if you jump on something which is quite good and it's got a good reputation, a lot of local authorities, they're all looking for that wonderful silver bullet to save money on. So if there's one organization that can save them money,
Yeah.
a lovely system, or able to get people from A to B a lot quicker, or dare I say a lot greener, and using maybe bikes instead of cars fueled with diesel and so forth. They're looking to really tick a box on so many elements. So if you can do that, then that also puts you in good stead as well.
And
Yeah.
quite right. And what we are seeing is we are seeing a slow growth of companies that are coming into the market. But if you're a franchise, you've probably invested tens of thousands of pounds in the franchise. So you have some financial standing. That's going to tick a box for local authorities. The other thing is that we're seeing companies now starting up, but they're not limited companies or for-profit companies. They're starting their business as a social enterprise, as a not-for-profit.
Community interest companies.
Yeah, because they're not going to be buying a capital asset. They can still pay themselves in the same way, but there are various benefits, and it also ticks a box for many local authorities to be dealing with a not-for-profit organization or a social enterprise rather than a technically for-profit company.
Oh, that's brilliant. So for new providers who also want to come into the market, that's also another legal structure they can
Absolutely.
adopt.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. I just wanted to quickly touch upon the franchise, because you mentioned that it's a little too late. But I believe that in that space, innovation could also play a key role. Dudley mentioned that there are some new younger companies coming in and not doing the same, because initially when the franchise model started, like Caremark, Bluebird, and other successful franchising company, what people are buying into is the name. They have a good reputation and they know that they have the backing and support of that company. But now lots of providers can actually do that independently. So sometimes it begs the question why they need to franchise. However, I do feel if there is a company out there that is being quite innovative and coming and providing value from a new perspective, there could be room for the franchise model for them. So I just wanted to add that.
I think you're absolutely right. And we have seen what might be described as upmarket franchises coming into areas.
Upmarket franchises.
Yeah.
Okay.
Who focus on the private market. They charge much more money, but they have good websites. They have good people answering the telephone. Telephone is actually answered, which is doesn't always happen with a lot of providers. And they go out and seek work, and they've got that built-in reference, and they're not afraid to charge a good price because they have good service.
I mean, to add to that, which I agree upon, and it goes back when I speak as having my consultant hat on, is that people are heavily relying on local authority business. So if you can actually create your own lane and have your own private clientele, then that's very good. And I agree with Peter, that's another area in which to look at. But don't think you can just walk in there. It may need a lot more money spent on your system, making sure it's accurate. You know, if you want that private marketplace, make sure you have, you know, you've done everything to make sure you will be, you know, looked at accordingly in there. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think one other interesting point that Dudley's just reminded me about, one provider needed a new office, somewhere to work, because they had an office down a back street, and the lease was up. So they got a cheap lease on a retail premise on the edge of a shop centre. And from that, they sort of vinyled out the windows, saying what they did. And by having those vinyls there, they got people walking in going, can you provide care for us?
That's so innovative. Again, another example of innovative ideas that bring success. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you so much, Dudley, for your time today. I've learned so much myself, even as a consultant and as someone who provides tender writing. I've learned one or two things, and it's been such a pleasure to have both of you on here. Usually we like to end on a lighter note, and just to give listeners more information about yourself. Now, every week we have the weekly comics that we write, and we put out the comics out there to simplify complex topics. And for every comic strip, there's a lessons learned. We haven't actually decided the lessons learned this week, hence why I'm struggling, because it's about safeguarding. So Staying in the space of lessons learned, what lessons in your time as a professional in the health and social care, and again on a lighter note, what lessons could the listeners, because these listeners they could be carers, social care providers who want to come into the sector, people who are currently in the sector, so there are we're hoping that lots of people will be listening in who are different players in the sector or may not be in the sector, but what they all have in common is they have an interest in the social care space. So you're both professionals, you've been in this industry for a long time. So what would be your takeaway? What advice would you give to anybody who is looking to come in or who has an interest in the health and social care space?
I'll leave it to Peter. I think you're going to give the words of wisdom.
The words of wisdom. Maybe we should name the segment words of wisdom.
I think if you're an existing company, existing organization, then what one finds sometimes is that the managers or the owners don't talk to the people they work with. They don't talk to their staff, and they could learn a lot. You know, if they're going to do tenders, they could talk to their staff. They learn a lot about how to operate from talking to their staff. And the other thing is for people who are thinking of coming in, who may be volunteering at the moment or working as carers, before you actually take the plunge and put your money in, you need to have done your market research. You need to have a business plan, because even if you get some work, cash flow is not going to happen instantly, and cash flow tends to be king.
Thank you, Peter. How about you, Dudley?
Just from a safeguarding point of view, I think safeguarding, and I'm going to use the term now more, safeguarding your business is
okay. I like that.
Yeah. So we're talking about these businesses not just for today, but for tomorrow. So think about a long-term plan. Think of a succession plan. Don't just, for example, grow older. Try and bring in younger talent. Try and bring other people who are going to make your business be more attractive. Try and attract staff from different cultures and communities. So actually your business itself is safeguarded because it's going to last, because it's more than just a service. It actually provides a lot more than that. So that's what I would say.
Thank you so much, Dudley, and thank you so much, Peter. You have both been a source of inspiration to us all. We wish you all the best in the health and social care sector. Thank you so much for the contributions and all the values that you've added to the sector and to numerous social care providers you have supported. To our listeners, thank you so much for listening to today's episode, and we hope that everything you've heard today is going to enable you grow successfully and bid right.